I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story.
Oh, I got a friend request.
Oh, shit.
Nigeria?
The boy is American, correct? Are you trying to scam him?
If you've only seen us in Hollywood movies, this is what you might think of us. We are obsessed with violence.
Where is the diamond?
Activity is high as foreign nationals continue to be evacuated from all over Nigeria.
This is Africa.
In recent years, there has been a growing demand for authentic African stories in Hollywood.
There are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person.
The representation of Africa in Western films has often been marred by stereotypes and misinterpretations.
My country is once again broken. Death is spreading.
To insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me.
Hollywood has a long history of relegating Africans to secondary roles or using the continent as a backdrop for white characters' journeys.
There is nothing more dangerous than a brave Western protagonist.
Are you okay?
What if I helped you find your family?
The extraordinary story of one man on the road to civilization.
It's strongly suggested that we abandon these refugees out here. I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to do that.
We, like all Ethiopians, are in danger, but we alone are getting help. Help from men I have contacted.
This is no good if you don't come back.
I always come back. Welcome to Zangaro.
This is not America, Mr. Brown.
But if you lost your head, that's another.
Western films perpetuated stereotypes of Africa as a place of poverty, war, and corruption.
Government only wants to stay in power until they've stolen enough to go into exile somewhere else.
The rivers again have turned red with blood.
You know, in America it's bling bling, but out here it's bling bang. A diamond is my ticket out of this God-forsaken continent.
If you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
These narratives overshadowed the vibrant cultures, rich histories, and diverse experiences found across the continent.
If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner.
It's more common than you think. An email from Nigeria with the promise of riches for helping a prince reclaim his fortune.
One example of Hollywood's problematic portrayal of Africa is the Nigerian prince cliché, which explores the association of Nigeria with internet and email scams.
Huh, got a new email here, and it's from a Nigerian prince.
When the son of the deposed king of Nigeria emails you directly asking for help, you help.
What's with the donations jar?
That's for my friend on Facebook.
Oh, the one from Nigeria?
Yes, how'd you know? Nassim.
Yeah, it's a scam.
Exactly what Nassim said you would say.
Carter sent $100,000 to a Nigerian prince who's gonna give him $1 million.
Don't tell me you two fell for that scam. It's the oldest email scam out there. The assets are frozen.
The hackneyed scenario reinforces stereotypes of Nigeria as a place where everyone is scrambling for cash and engaging in fraudulent activities.
You're a Nigerian scammer. You can just say scammer.
There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person.
Hollywood's tendency to focus on poverty, crime, and child soldiers when telling African stories has led to the phenomenon of poverty porn. These formulaic narratives perpetuate the idea that Africa is a continent defined by suffering and backwardness.
I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity.
This portrayal not only misrepresents the realities of African nations, but also reinforces negative stereotypes held by Western audiences.
My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition. Incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it.
Foreign-owned businesses and shops are being looted. The owner of a shop, a Nigerian businessman, was beaten.
South Africans think all foreigners are here illegally.
But where did you get the money from?
I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story.
All workers will receive free beer
in a place no one man could conquer.
This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child.
While Hollywood has often fallen short in its depiction of Africa, There have been notable instances of authentic representation that have challenged stereotypes and resonated with audiences globally. Coming to America broke new ground in its depiction of an African nation. Unlike other Western films, it portrayed Amanda as a wealthy and self-reliant African country, challenging the prevalent narrative of poverty and stagnation. The film's success demonstrated that audiences were hungry for diverse African stories that went beyond stereotypes. In 2018, Black Panther became a cultural phenomenon, shattering box office records and garnering critical acclaim. The film presented the fictional African nation of Wakanda as a technologically advanced and culturally rich society. By centering African characters and celebrating African culture, Black Panther provided a much-needed counter-narrative to Hollywood's typical portrayal of Africa.
It is your time.
It proved that authentic African stories could resonate with global audiences and achieve commercial success.
Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize.
Another significant example of authentic African storytelling is Beyoncé's film Black is King. Released in 2020, the film celebrated Black identity and empowerment, showcasing diverse African cultures and talents. By collaborating with artists from across the continent, Beyoncé brought African narratives to the forefront, challenging stereotypes and highlighting the beauty and richness of African heritage.
As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African.
Sheba, and she was the most beautiful queen in the world, and she traveled all the way from Africa to visit Solomon in Jerusalem. Thousands of years later, part of our family's in Africa, and that's why I have to help them.
But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia.
One of the persistent issues in Hollywood's depiction of Africa is the tendency to generalize the continent and its diverse cultures.
Although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries.
Films continue to perpetuate the notion of Africa as a homogeneous entity, failing to acknowledge its rich diversity.
Nelson Mandela and Winnie.
Those hungry babies with the flies on the face.
These generalizations stem from a lack of understanding and limited exposure to the real Africa among Western audiences. The need for African perspectives to overcome these challenges. It is essential to amplify African voices and perspectives in the filmmaking process.
Single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story.
Hey yo, escort souls of departed Lagos kings to the other world.
African filmmakers bring an authentic, and nuanced understanding of their cultures, allowing for more accurate and respectful portrayals of African stories. By involving African talent in writing, directing, and producing films, Hollywood can ensure that African narratives are told from within, rather than through an outsider's lens.
So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are.
The inclusion of more African voices in the filmmaking process is crucial to ensuring authentic representation, with streaming platforms like Netflix providing a global stage for African films. The visibility and recognition of African filmmakers are increasing. This shift allows for a more diverse range of narratives and challenges the dominance of Western perspectives in shaping African stories.
Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity.
This is how you end up with a Michael Blackson, who's a real African doing a fake African accent. Okay,
Give me my damn money back right now, and I don't have no damn receipt. You know you're f***ing with Bishop Tudo. Try again, motherfucker.
Crazy motherfucker, but nasty with paint. Even the postman. It used to be a thing you could get the postman easy, but now they're all scared.
You gotta go to Africa and get a school, dude. Everybody got, you gotta put in some work.
The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar.
As Hollywood continues to grapple with the challenge of authentic African representation, there are signs of progress and hope for the future, broadening perspectives and breaking stereotypes.
I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature.
You want to see the real Lagos?
Yes, let's go.
Films like Black Panther and Black is King have shattered stereotypes and broadened perspectives on Africa. By presenting African cultures in a positive and empowering light, these films have challenged the dominant narratives of poverty and suffering. Their success has shown that audiences are hungry for diverse stories that reflect the richness and complexity of Africa.
Welcome to Lagos, Nigeria.
Audiences also play a vital role in shaping the future of African representation in Hollywood. By supporting and demanding authentic African stories, viewers can drive change in the industry.
We have more than a stereotype. Let's change the perception.
Increased demand for diverse narratives will encourage Hollywood to invest in projects that give voice to African filmmakers and challenge stereotypes.
It would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America.
But in a country at war with itself,
Hollywood's portrayal of Africa has often been marred by stereotypes and misrepresentations. However, there are signs of progress as more authentic African stories gain recognition and success. By amplifying African voices, broadening perspectives, and supporting African cinema, Hollywood can move towards a future where African stories are told with authenticity, respect, and nuance.
So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become.
Please click the subscribe button if you enjoy this video and are curious about Nigerian art, culture, people, and market. Thank you.